Alright, so we've covered a lot of Stephen King on this channel. Like, a lot of Stephen King. You can go back and you look at some of the movies we've talked about, and that just in general. But then there's like the whole series we did of his short stories that have been made into movies, then his novellas that have been made into movies. And so here, I thought there's going to be 5 of these throughout the month where I decided on 5 books of his that were translated to movies that we're just going to do this whole book versus movie thing on. And while they might seem a bit random, and some of them may seem underwhelming, I was kind of trying to go for movies that we haven't talked about yet. But the thing about it is, one of these 5 that we're going to do this with throughout the month is one that we've talked about, a movie we've talked about. I just forgot that we talked about it, so that one's going to be in here on top of 4 more, starting with this one. So that's what this is, essentially. So, I will say right away, since this is kind of the first time doing this entire book versus movie thing, and a thick book at that, this, and the fact that it's this story, it's the story of Dreamcatcher. This might be a total clusterfuck. Like this, like, notes and all that, like, I was kind of stressing about doing this one because everything about this is so all over the place. And it feels like to talk to you coherently about this book and this movie is nearly impossible, so it might be a little bit all over the place, but since the story itself is, I'm hoping that's appropriate enough. So, I guess that's what we're gonna do here, because you see, everybody, like, I feel like everybody and their mother on some sort of podcast or video or something has talked about the insanity that is Dreamcatcher's movie, and the absurdity that is Dreamcatcher's movie. Like, how did this get made? Did it at one point? That's the only one I really listened to. But I can imagine what all has probably been said. And initially, I would think that my plan would be to sort of defend it, because when you have the context of the book, and a book this thick and detailed, that there might be some things that obviously won't make sense, but would to somebody who has read it. Sometimes that might happen. Other times, it's just this trying to crack this story in general. It is worth noting that I'm sure has been brought up in every time somebody's talked about this, if they've looked into it. Dreamcatcher is, I've defended so much King. A lot of the King that's been bashed too is stuff that I have defended. But Dreamcatcher is not one of his best. And obviously he knows that as well. If you look it up and you know the whole story about how when he got hit by the minivan in the 90s, and then he was recovering, is when he started writing this. He started writing this freehand, and he was on a lot of Oxycontin at the time. And this is what came out. And this is, and he has said that he looks back on it, and he's not a fan of what he wrote. So, it makes sense, but there is a kind of story in here. We get a lot of, some of his strengths, like the way he approaches friendship and stuff like that. But we also get a lot of his sort of dead ends, if you will. But what's interesting about this book, though, is you look at the content of it, and the story, and the structure of it, and how so much of it is, like, mind-based, and, like, based on dream logic, and what the characters are thinking, and how they communicate mentally. And you would think, this one is probably not the first King you jump on to adapt to the screen. It seems like it'd be very difficult to do. Not to mention it just being not one of his stronger stories. But with that said, there's a lot of movie things going on in it. He goes so far as to start casting the characters as actors, sometimes in the book. Like, he keeps mentioning, like, if the content of the story was a James Cameron movie, it would be, like, Bruce Dern would be Gosling, the guy that owns the store, which did not come to be. and he was imagining James Woods or Christopher Walken as Kurtz, who became Curtis in the movie, the Morgan Freeman character. And I like the detail that he put where he's like, the James Cameron movie would cast James Woods or Walken, even though they don't actually look like Kurtz. So he was like really specific about what a movie of this would look like as it went on. Not to mention the whole detail that the movie takes out completely of Kurtz supposedly naming himself after the Apocalypse Now character because he's just that fucking insane. That's who he relates to. And the idea that not only did the movie not take that route, they changed his name so they didn't have to go that route. So now he's just Curtis. And it's interesting also, like, the casting of Freeman, because you look at Kurtz or Curtis as a character, maybe that's why their name changed too, because they feel like two different characters, because while Freeman's character feels like a kind of this sort of military tyrant in a way that's bent on destruction, the Kurtz of the book is so incredibly unhinged. I was starting to imagine, like, Jeffrey Combs. Like Jeffrey Combs bringing his Frighteners energy, is how I started imagining Kurtz, even though when I was reading the book, I already knew that Freeman played the part. I'd actually already seen the movie and just forgotten most of it when I read the book. And then it was recently that I rewatched the movie, pretty much for the purpose of doing this. But there's also the thing where Jonesy has a lot of movie knowledge and how much that actually plays a part once Mr. Grey is inside him. Because he's basically able to accept the situation because he has such a knowledge of horror movies. Like, horror movies are his thing. And so, when he's going through this whole thing, he's thinking about Parasite, the Demi Moore movie. He's thinking about Alien. In the book, they say They Came From Within, which we know is Shivers. The Cronenberg movie that we talked about just last year. And he's thinking about, like, Body Snatchers, and he's saying, like, he actually tells himself, like, I've been body snatched. And he even has he loves movies and horror so much, even in this situation, he has the presence of mind to think, I'm talking about Don Siegel's movie, not, in quotes, the wretched Philip Kaufman movie. We actually did a versus on those, like, last year or the year before, so that's a lot of this stuff has been talked about on here. And for some reason, they not only did they take that aspect away from Jonesy in the movie, it's kind of Beaver's thing in the movie. But the thing is it's not even that he's a horror guy, he just seems to be a movie guy, but he's not even a great movie guy because he keeps forgetting people's names. Like, he calls Kiefer Sutherland Reefer Sutherland, and he can't remember Telly Savalas' name. But he can remember these movies that they were in. And that's... and I guess that's what I want to go into next, is the friendship angle and the dialogue and the banter between them. So, here's the thing. When you talk about another thing of, is this even doable as a movie? And you look at Lawrence Kasdan getting the job of directing it, and you think, that seems random, but at the same time, maybe not, because we talked about how there's so much of a friendship theme in a lot of King's stories, and the way he portrays friendship and young friendship and, like, lifelong friendship is incredible. It's some of the best stuff he's ever done, like It and The Body and stuff like that. Even, like, the destruction of friendship with Christine. Like, when he has these relationships and these friendships in his stories, they're so detailed to the point that they feel like people you know. So you obviously get the idea that these are people that have known each other, and you get to feel their connections and see their connections, and it feels real. Like, everything about it feels so grounded, regardless of the supernatural stuff that's happening around it. And that's, like, one of his things, like, one of his main things that he can do. And even when you read, like, you know, the opening moments of the book, like when Beaver's sitting in the bar and he's just, like, longing to call, I think he's longing to call Henry, Henry or Jonesy. And just the way that's described, you can feel it. You can feel how connected they are. Obviously here they're connected in many ways, but it's the emotional connection. You can really feel that. And then when they meet Dud, I guess the one thing is the big hurdle here about the portrayal of a friendship this close, that's believable in every other sense. This in both the book and the movie, there's one kind of unbelievable thing that ends up setting off the whole emotional arc of the story. Which is when they find that kid Richie bullying Duddits, and they stop this from happening. And in both the book and the movie, the way they stop this from happening, and I bring this up especially because it's like if you were adapting the movie, you had the opportunity to change this to make it something better and more believable. But they tell Richie, this star athlete, they're going to tell on him. And that's how they meet Duddits. That's how this big bond forms, is they put the fear of God into Richie, a star athlete of the school, by telling him they're going to tell on him. So take that for what you will as far as how this relationship with Duddits starts. That is the entire emotional arc of the story. But we'll let that go at that. What I do think is another big death knell in this that doesn't make this group of friends near as strong as the Losers Club or the Kids in the Body or whatever, is two of them die way too early. Beaver definitely dies way too, and there's so much focus on Beaver too. We get like a whole backstory, and like everybody gets their whole backstory, and then he seems like one of the real core members of the group. He's the one that sings to Duddits and makes everything good again. He's the one that he basically creates the vocabulary of the group. It's all his catchphrases and everything. And the movie's not even... This movie that's like 2 hours and 15 minutes is not even an hour in when Beaver is dead. And then Pete dies not too long after that, and it's mostly just Henry and Jonesy at the end of the day. And that feels really weak. And really unfortunate because, like I said, this is the territory that King does so well. But that was the really long way to say that Kasdan would have been an appropriate director, because if the focus was really on the friends, the way it is in something like It or The Body, don't forget, Kasdan's the guy that made The Big Chill. Like a whole stellar movie about the reuniting of friends. That's another thing that's been talked about on this channel. There's a whole video of me talking about how much I love The Big Chill. And that's the kind of vibe we could have and should have had when we have the four in one place and we're doing this whole thing. When they first get out to the cabin and everything. But the problem here, another thing that seems like it's not very adaptable, is this thing where they talk in catchphrases and basically have their own vocabulary and their own like inside language or whatever. There's a lot... The banter in the movie feels very disjointed. Where it's like there's banter in the kitchen between Jason Lee and Timothy Olyphant, who are Beaver and Pete, and they seem like they're not even having the same conversation. But the thing is that pretty much the same dialogue is in the book, and when you see it in the full context of the book, it does make more sense. It feels... I don't know if it's because in your head you can imagine it being said certain ways that make it make sense for you, or make it sound right for you. But to have two actors, by the way, the four actors here, Thomas Jane, Damian Lewis, Jason Lee, and Timothy Olyphant, you can't really have a better cast. But when you have dialogue like this, it's kind of hard to imagine what the height of the chemistry could have been, because they don't really reach it, even though all of them are capable of chemistry like that. Especially Jason Lee, coming from the Kevin Smith background. It makes you think, like, if the dialogue had maybe been more improvised, It might have been more natural, but you can tell how scripted it all is, and how scripted it has to be because of all the catchphrases and the inside language and all that. And that sort of takes away from it. There is that moment when Beaver's talking about Promised Land, and he's doing that, and yes, that actually is a real movie, but with that actual quote. But like I said, I don't know if it's just in the back of my head that they took the movie personality trait from Jonesy that was so crucial to the story and put it in Beaver just so he could have a couple of throwaway lines like the Promised Land one. I don't know. It just doesn't feel like, even if I didn't know that, it still just kind of feels unnatural the way they're talking to each other, which, like I said, should be the heart of the movie. But it just feels kind of awkward. You don't really get the vibe that they've been friends for life, except for the fact that the story's telling you that when you actually see them interact, which is a shame. But then, like I was talking about, there's all of the internalized stuff, like when we hear everything that's going on in their heads in the book. So when like Henry goes off on Barry, his patient, that makes a lot more sense where Henry's coming from in the book than it does in the... Because in the movie, he seems to just do it spontaneously, when there's a whole build-up to it that's been up to that point. And then there's the probably one of the most egregious things that I can only imagine drives people watching the movie with no knowledge of the book crazy. And that's it. Like, when I say I haven't watched, like, all these other, like, long-form reviews of this movie, where people, I assume, are roasting it, one thing people probably get really stuck on is, why the fuck is Beaver reaching for his toothpick when he has to keep the weasel in the toilet? Which I'm realizing saying out loud is a very strange sentence out of context. Hopefully everybody here knows what's going on in this story. But yes, so the moment when Beaver drops his toothpicks, many of them landing in the blood, and there's that one that hasn't, and he's willing to sacrifice his life to pick up that toothpick off the bathroom floor. And it's like there's the whole thing going on in the book where we get the whole backstory of, not only is he, like, you know, quitting addictions and stuff like that, but it's like just the whole thing of that's like always been, like, he's lost when he's not doing that. And the whole thing where it comes full circle where when he was a kid he would, like, chew them and end up, like, eating them, like, over time in very, very small pieces, and his mom would always say, like, those toothpicks are going to be the death of you one day, or those toothpicks will literally kill you one day. And the fact that in his adulthood, that's exactly what happens, but in a way his mother could have never foreseen when she said that, where they would get him killed by an alien shit weasel. So, but the idea of he is not going to be able to sit on that toilet long enough to keep that thing down unless he can relax himself in the only way he can, which is those. And, like, the book does a good enough job, I think, getting you in the headspace of, if he has to do this, then he needs to reach that toothpick. Like I said, if you don't have any of that context in the movie, it looks like the dumbest thing a movie character has ever done. The dumbest way a movie character has ever died. So you need that in there somehow, but that's what I'm saying is, how do you even adapt that? Because, like, how do you adapt those feelings those characters have? So it feels like mid-movie they were starting to try to figure that out. So a lot of the characters just start talking out loud. So we have that whole long scene where Pete's stranded out there with the woman, and he has a whole expositional monologue by himself under the guise of he's talking to this woman, just because. And then right after that we cut to Henry walking through the woods, just talking right out loud to himself. And it's like, all of this makes so much more sense in the book when it's all in their heads and all internalized. But yeah, I guess if you did a lot of voiceover for the movie, that wouldn't really work a lot either. It'd be very clear you were doing something that it is hard to adapt for the screen. Like, literally being inside the characters' heads. So, let's talk about that. Adapting literally being inside the characters' heads, with Jonesy being trapped in his own mind. Like, Jonesy's essentially in the sunken place while Mr. Gray is running around. So, there's the whole thing of the memory warehouse, where we're inside Jonesy's mind. And it makes enough sense and feels right enough when you're reading it, because you can imagine, like, that's how, Jonesy's mind is organized. I don't know if I'm ruined by the SpongeBob episode where he has all the file cabinets in his head and there's multiple SpongeBobs running around, and then when they forget something, like, everything's on fire and all that. But looking at it that way, you can say, is there an effective way to do that? Well, I can actually think of 2 examples, and both of them are King adaptations, just to be appropriate. There is the boxes in Doctor Sleep. I thought Flanagan did that extremely well, and, like, putting the maze inside his mind and having the confrontation with Rose in there. That was really well done. And even though I ultimately wasn't a fan of the Mr. Mercedes series and how much it deviated, when you look at the way they handled the being inside Brady Hartsfield's mind and the way they visually pulled that off, it was actually, for a show that ultimately lost the plot literally, I thought that was done surprisingly well, and in ways that I wouldn't have thought of if I had to think of how to adapt the whole Mr. Mercedes trilogy mind thing that was going on, and the body hopping thing that was going on. So there are definitely ways to do it, but when it's this crucial to the story, where it's basically how the characters operate completely, I don't know. I guess the literal memory, like the literal nature of what we see in regards to that stuff, is one of those, either you run with it or you don't. And I think a lot of people didn't. So that's pretty much how a lot of that goes. And by the way, while we're on the topic of Mr. Gray and Jonesy and this whole thing going on, there's also the thing about Jonesy's voice. There's many things that are off about this. First of all, you have, like, Shakespearean trained actor Damian Lewis, who can do so many things, very diverse, doing this cartoon character voice whenever he's Mr. Gray. And I guess it's like, oh, we'll give him an acting showcase because he's capable, so we'll have him do one thing and then this completely off the wall thing, and then he's able to go back and forth. Like, then that's a pretty good acting challenge for somebody like him. Well, it probably would have been a lot better and a lot more threatening and scary if we're being real, if it was any voice except the one they went with. Including the expressions. It could have been anything else. But the other thing that just really drops the ball here is, am I mistaken, or is there not explicitly a moment in the book when Jonesy thinks about how scary and eerie it is hearing his own voice when Mr. Gray talks? Like, wasn't that a whole thing? That it's scary because Mr. Gray sounds exactly like him? So that just went wrong in every way, going with that decision. You got to embarrass Damian Lewis, you got to abandon the scary aspect of it, and you've made it laughable. That's like everything in regards to the Mr. Gray side of Jonesy just went wrong. So that's just unfortunate for everybody involved. But talking more about how hard this is to adapt. Like, I mean, even if the movie is all over the place and really didn't accomplish many of its goals, you do have to give credit to the fact that it's had to have been so hard to even try to adapt this. So, like, whoever had the initial idea to adapt it just because it was a King book that came out, and because it was a King book, success automatically. It has to be. I think there was 2 years between publication and the release of the movie. So, but anyway, the point I'm getting at is the dream logic. Like, a dream is in the title, so we're gonna be factoring in that kind of stuff. And so you have the dream logic that comes through in the book. So, like, these things that seem really, like, I guess, convenient and outlandish and absurd, but, like, things that make sense when you're dreaming. Trying to convey that and use it to the character's advantages throughout it, is a really hard thing to do in a movie. So, when you look at stuff like when Jonesy's having all these visions as his body's being taken over by Mr. Gray, and it's like the fact that you don't know what's in the future, what's in the past, what's happening right now. There's the dream that Jonesy seems to be having where when he gets hit by the car, and it's like, so we're seeing the past when he got hit by the car, but he's also seeing aliens. In the movie, he sees Duddits. I can't remember if Duddits is there in the book, but he's definitely seeing aliens in the book. And so it's the thing of, was this what he actually saw when he got hit by the car? Or is he dreaming after the fact about getting hit by the car, and now he's seeing aliens because Mr. Gray's in his mind? In the book, that's interesting, because, like Jonesy, we're so disoriented, we don't know where we are. Because so many things are going on in the mind, and people are coming in and out. People and aliens, all that stuff. And these, traumatizing past events, like, everything's just bleeding together, and you don't know where the fuck you are. In a book, that's really fascinating, and in a movie, it could be, but they don't even really try to do much like that. Like, they actually, once again, he goes into movie mode in the book when he's talking about this, because he talks about, he compares Jonesy's visions to a poorly edited movie. And when it happens, he's like, the editor's been drinking on the job, and all of that. So, that's stuff where it's like, he was so setting this up as a movie, but it's really hard to carry over. And also, another thing the movie doesn't even touch on is the Marcy thing, which I actually thought was really sort of creepy and eerie in the book. When Jonesy's in the hospital, and he could swear he hears somebody in the hallway saying, "Where's Marcy?" Whether it be a patient or somebody looking for a patient that's maybe died. And there's a point in time where he mistakes Marcy for Jonesy, and it's something that sticks with him forever, where he thinks that was the sound of the Grim Reaper looking for him, and saying, "Where's Jonesy?" walking around the hospital looking for him. And then you get the moment where people get into his mind, and they're hearing the word Marcy, and they have no idea why it's in there, but we, the reader, knows why it's in there, and it's really creepy. And there's a lot of scary elements in the book that did not carry over to the movie. Like, I don't know that I could tell you a scary scene in the movie. There's gruesome scenes. There's, monster scenes. But I don't know that I could tell you... I think the closest we get is Beaver in the bathroom. There is that moment when... there's the build-up to McCarthy being trapped in the bathroom, and them deciding that they're going to go in. And there's a little... They build it up a lot more in the book, but... that we don't quite know what we're going to see when they burst in. And that horrified look on Jason Lee's face especially says a lot. So that whole bathroom scene is probably the closest we get to like a really genuine sort of scary scene in this movie. But after that, there's so much ridiculousness that kind of overshadows it. But stuff that only really King seems to be able to capture. Like, there's always moments in King books, the good ones and the lesser ones, where it's like, I know exactly that feeling, but I would have never ever known to articulate it, or even it wouldn't have even occurred to me that I would need to articulate it at any point. And then he just kind of does, and you're familiar with it immediately. There's the moment when Duddits' mom, Roberta, is, at this moment, Duddits is already saying, Beaver's dead and Pete's dead, because he can obviously sense, he knows these things as they happen. And so when Roberta there's a knock at the door and it's Henry, and Roberta doesn't want to answer because she's imagining that it's the dead Beaver and Pete, and they've come from the afterlife to take Duddits with them. And it's like that kind of irrational fear is something that's so specific and might seem really off the wall, but as as real people who experience irrational fears, it makes perfect sense that Roberta would think that and be afraid of that in that moment, especially since Duddits is dying already. So stuff like that is something that's never going to come through in a movie adaptation. There's also the stuff in the book where Mr. Grey is just so animalistic, because in the movie he's just Lewis doing that voice. Is basically all Mr. Grey really is. We've got the whole. I love the fascination when he learns to murder, and then he learns to love bacon, and the fact I think there's even like one specific line where it's like bacon and murder are his favorite things now. Which is so out there, but in this like sort of eerie way. And then we have like the whole thing where he's like mass consuming bacon, and you can see like his vomit trail as the whole chase is happening. All of that, and even these details of like the fact that it sets Mr. Grey back that Jonesy's out of shape. And the fact that he was, like, I think they say he was always academic, so he never focused on his body. And so, I think the line is, at that point, when Mr. Grey had his body, Jonesy was what he always wanted to be, nothing but mind. That's the good shit. That's the good king coming through in this story that we all seem to agree is one of his lesser books. And the fact that that's such a big setback for Mr. Grey, who's all body at this point. That's the good stuff, and that's the stuff that you really can't translate. And the movie doesn't even try to translate that part, really. The way Mr. Grey basically learns to murder is through Jonesy's memories of the talented Mr. Ripley. He even specifies the when he kills Freddie Miles. That particular scene is exactly how Mr. Grey kills somebody and realizes that he can kill people. Stuff like that is stuff that I really miss when I watch the movie. As far as the movie goes, I suppose we could go into like effects wise. You would think the weasels would be another thing that's sort of hard to make scary, but I do think they do it effectively enough. And so when you have stuff like when they're like laying eggs, you have like the little baby ones, and it's like it's one of those cases where you can see where the CGI is, but then sometimes like a practical one will come in and like surprise you, especially when they die and they like flop to the ground. Like that's clearly something that's really there, and that's something we can really appreciate when they do that. When it gets to the bigger effects, that's when they get a little shoddy, like when Curtis is doing his whole massacre. And when we see like the ship, like kind of not so much. Like it almost seems like they're effects concepts that aren't complete effects when we see the ship and that whole sequence. You look at this story and you see how much military presence there is, how much focus there is on Underhill and that whole thing. And it becomes like a vendetta story in the book, which never carry over to the movie, between Kurtz and Underhill. But what I was trying to think about was, usually in horror movies like this, or alien movies like this or whatever, they're usually a lot more interesting until the military presence comes into it, and then it just kind of becomes very generic. So I was thinking, like, with it being so present in this story, I'm trying to imagine what would this story be like without the presence of the military? If it was just the alien stuff, like out in the cabin, like when it was, like when it starts out and Jonesy meets McCarthy in the woods, this stranger who's been wandering around for seemingly days, and there's a snowstorm trapping them with this person, and as this person is talking, their story just progressively doesn't add up, and they're starting to have physical changes, and it's like there's a whole story just right here. Like, just this aspect, and adding on the aspect of they've been friends since childhood and that whole thing. You'd barely have to bring the whole telepathy aspect into it, except for the fact that Henry and Pete are still out in the storm. But it's like the idea of them being out there with the woman that's in the same situation as this guy. There's something here, but then... And then the military comes in, and then that ends up being a lot of the story. So it's like I kind of wonder what they could have done, what he could have done with the story if it had just been that. But that's just a what if. I'm not saying if it would have been better or worse or whatever. I just would be curious where else it would go. Also, as it goes on, and I said we get narrowed down to really just Henry and Jonesy, and Jonesy's mostly Mr. Grey anyway, so when you look at Henry basically being at the center of this story, there's the whole connection he has with Underhill throughout the book that is not really much present here. Like, it feels like he and Sizemore don't get a lot to do together. They don't really have a sort of chemistry that they probably should if you're going to be these characters that were in the book. And not to mention, just in general, the Henry of the movie, much as I love Thomas Jane, I really, really love Thomas Jane in general, the Henry of the movie is just not engaging. And he certainly doesn't have those moments like Chapter 11, which I think is called The Eggman's Journey. It's when he goes back to the cabin and he sees everything and he sees the eggs and all that. And it's basically a whole chapter just devoted to Henry descending into insanity in real time. Descending into madness, detail by detail. And he kind of states that, like, that moment changes him for the rest of the story. I do not in any way get that vibe from the movie Henry. That's something that could have been really interesting, especially for Jane to play. Could have been really interesting, because Jane can do Unhinged. But I don't feel like there was much of an ounce of that in the movie adaptation of Henry, so that's something that's maybe could have changed things. But as far as, like, so I'm talking the book up a lot and the movie down. There's problems with the book. There's like there's a whole Kurtz exposition dump of what we've already witnessed through the four of them, and like even the headlines at the beginning before the story even starts in the book. And it just kind of seems like it goes over this over and over and over again, stuff we already know. It reminded me of the middle portions of Firestarter that I didn't really like. I know Firestarter is a pretty loved book, but I struggled with many places of Firestarter because of redundancy and getting way too into explaining what's going on seemingly over and over again when we kind of figured it out, basically. I feel like you kind of fell into that trap again. There's a lot of rambling going on. There's a lot of tangents. There's the whole proprietor of the place where he goes to get bacon, when he stops for bacon. We get that proprietor's whole background. We get his outlook on politics and his married life. And this is like in the final stretch of this chase that's going on for a large portion of the book. Like, we're finally ramping it up for the climax, and we suddenly get the entire life story of this random character, which basically, I know a lot of people will say, like, that's King's style, but it's like, it feels more like parody of King than something he would actually do at the point in the story in which he does it. And there's the story of the Russian woman, with like the reservoir that we get, and that's one that's like, it's a good portion of the story and it gives the background of what happened there. I think it's something we could have gotten a lot earlier than we did, because much like the whole learning the proprietor's whole backstory for no reason when it's a nothing character, it's happening right as we're ramping up to the final moments and what we've been building up to. So it's like, for pacing's sake and for, the flow of it, I think we could have gotten the story of the Russian woman earlier and then let it circle back around. But yeah, there's also you know, we're gonna jump around again. There's some more visual stuff I don't really care for in the movie that they changed. There's some stuff that would be hard to do, like I do like that the movie got some of the like really specific details, like Duddits' yellow Scooby-Doo lunchbox is pretty much exactly how you imagine. I feel like even like the design of his shirt is pretty much exactly as it's described in the book. But then we have stuff like the line or whatever it is that Pete uses to find things, and if I remember correctly, in the book, the description is that it's like yellow and vague, something like that. If I'm not mistaking it for something else, in the movie, it's more like the Donnie Darko wormholes, and and the way these come in, and we'll talk again how they used it in a scene that ended up not making the movie. But there's also stuff that's really great in the book, like the Josie Ringenauer story, when they find her, and because it's King, he has to get this group of kids down to the sewer, of course. So they are in Derry too. So there even is a reference to Pennywise towards the end, where his name's like graffitied on something, and the Losers Club's names are all there. But yeah, this story where before they find her, they have to summon a vision of her. And in the book, it's sort of like... This is probably a weird example and a weird comparison. It's sort of like in the original live-action Ninja Turtles movie when they summon the spirit of Splinter in the campfire. And it's like this actual emotional moment they all feel together. And it was their togetherness that brought this vision. That's basically what happens with Josie, where but the great thing about it, that the book's details go into, is that, like parts of this vision change based on each of their perspectives of her and what's going on and what they've seen and what they know. That's really interesting. There, in the movie, they think they just used the Donnie Darko wormhole. And that's what it is. So that's stuff that I wish had translated better, and would have helped like the character work also, and also about the character work, the idea that they really wanted to do the foreshadowing thing, but they do it in ways that almost feels like it kind of betrays their relationship with Duddits, because one of the things that makes them so close in the book is that they can always understand what Duddits is saying when nobody else can. And there's a couple of moments they throw... I don't remember this in the book. It might be in there. But I feel like the book made it explicit that they always were able to understand what Duddits was saying. So we get that moment when he says... they're talking about saving the girl, and he says saving the world. And then there's the moment when he says he's trying to say Mr. Gray, and Beaver thinks he's saying mystery. And it's like, I like it for like foreshadowing, like he always knew what the outcome was going to be. But at the same time, it does, like I said, it feels like it betrays the thing of they could always understand him. But also, the movie does this thing where it thinks the audience won't remember that. So when we come to that realization, we have to flash back and watch the scene all over again. And it's like, yeah, I remember this scene. Yeah, I know. I remember back then. Even if somebody hadn't read the book, they could probably put together, oh, that sounded like foreshadowing. I'll bet that was foreshadowing. But it's the fact that they do that again. They do that a second time when Henry's talking about, like, the smaller, like, the little baby weasels. And there's a whole flashback to a scene we just saw, where he was, like, in the cabin, because it thinks the audience has a really short attention span. So, that's... just stuff like that is irksome, I guess you could call it. But let's talk about probably the biggest change from book to movie. And when I say biggest change, I mean a really big chunk of this book. And if you look, there are several chapter titles that make reference to the fact that a large portion of the second half of this is a chase, where Kurtz is chasing Underhill and Henry, and they're trying to get to Duds and then get to the water to stop this from happening. We've got Jonesy in the front, we've got Henry, Underhill, and eventually Duddits here, and we've got Kurtz back here, and it's this chase that goes on and on and on and on. And in the context of the book, it could be shorter. It could be cut down, but I like the chase factor. That is going on, and that's how we're revving up to the climax. Is one person's behind another person's behind them, and it's this 3-area chase going on. The chase in the movie is Freeman stealing a helicopter. That's it. Flies himself right there. And is immediately shot down by Underhill. Immediately. There is barely a gun battle here, and he's shot down with a gun, like a handgun. And Kurtz's death in the book is a lot more dramatic. Not like, theatrical, but like emotionally dramatic. And he's killed by a character that's not even in the movie. So there's that. But not only did they make the drastic change to take that chase out entirely, it's an understatement to say that they changed the ending. Because in the book, they pick up Duddits, he's already dying of leukemia, he gets them there, he helps them defeat Mr. Gray mentally. Like, in Jonesy's mind, we defeat Mr. Gray. And then Duddits passes away. Like, that was it. Like, that's all he had in him. They defeat Mr. Gray, they save Jonesy, they found the location, they stopped the worm from going in the water, and that's all he's got left, and he passes on. And then Henry just takes out the last remaining ones. I suppose I could kind of understand if somebody were to read this and say, well, if I'm making a movie, it's not very climatic. I think it works as an ending, at least the way I visualized it while reading it. But it was clear, like I said, when we got the slaughter sequence where they felt the need to be as effects heavy as possible, even if those effects weren't at, the top tier exactly. And we had the moment where Freeman stole the helicopter so he could be firing down on Underhill, and we could have this man versus helicopter battle. It's not going to be that easy, probably. So, what the movie does here is inexplicable. Like, there's not really anything previously in the movie that makes this make a lot of sense. Especially when you look at the part in the book right after they pick up Duddits and they leave, and it stays on Roberta, and she she comes to terms with the fact that he's gonna die out there. So she goes through the whole she starts her mourning process right after they leave. She goes into his room and does the whole thing. And there's something so human about that, and so human about what their relationship must have been. I keep stressing the word human in regards to Duddits and his mom, because the big reveal in the movie, which they keep saying, like Pete's weird rambling monologue to himself that he's trying to make a dialogue with this silent woman, is talking about how Duddits is like from another planet, Duddits is like an alien. If anything, it's quite blatant that they're trying to tell us that's the direction they're going, but that doesn't make it make any more sense. Duddits is an alien, I guess, in the movie. And that's how he defeats Mr. Gray. He turns into a big alien, and that's what does it. That's how he dies, and Mr. Gray. And the movie abruptly ends The movie just stops right there. So, here's what happened. I have this DVD, and if you look at the special features, the first special feature they list here on the back is the original ending. So it's like, oh, so they shot the original ending. The book's ending is what you would think the original ending is. Well, that's not really the case either. So, remember how I was talking about the line or whatever they call it? They went from making it something vague in the book to making it essentially one of the Donnie Darko wormholes. For some reason, they say, you click original ending, and it's an 8.5 minute clip. The entire first 4 to 4.5 minutes is the ending already as is. So we're just watching the end again, just without some of the effects and without the score. And then Duddits comes in, he throws his stuffed Scooby-Doo down, and he, completes the phrase, and then he does one of the Donnie Darko wormholes and basically zaps Mr. Grey to death. Like, he splatters. And then he does one more I Duddits and he dies. And then we get a moment that's actually kind of nice, where they go to the cemetery. It's Henry and Jonesy at the cemetery at Duddits' grave, and they sing the song. They sing the song that Beaver sang to him. And then the credits roll. The credits roll in silence. I'm gonna guess they would play, like, I'm assuming that's an actual song. Like, maybe that's what the end credit song would have been, if that was the ending. That's kind of nice, and it's also, like, there is an emotion. They're like at a cookout in the epilogue of the book, and so to, like, I think you need a little bit of an epilogue. I can appreciate a movie that just ends like that, if it ends on a high note and it's just like, we can't top this, we're ending now. The way the movie of Dreamcatcher ends is very abrupt, like noticeably abrupt. I think an epilogue like that cemetery scene, I think would have been good. I think they could have held on to that. But the whole thing, neither option of how Duddits and Mr. Grey die is satisfying with what the movie had. So I honestly think it's actually more satisfying that they defeated Mr. Grey mentally, which, once again, I guess they realized, like, they'd gotten this far, and now they're like, I don't know if we can do the literal mind stuff anymore. Let's have them be physical monsters in the same little arena here where the water is. I don't know. It's a clusterfuck of a story, as I started off saying. So, that's what this is. So, like I said, it's really not a perfect book at all. I don't think anybody's going to tell you that it is. King certainly isn't. But it's, like I said, it's got some of his really good qualities in there, and it's got some really good lines and some really good moments and some great emotion and some of those detailed moments, like the Josie vision and some of those, irrational fears being realized. There's some really good shit in here. But it's a ride to get to those moments. And like I said, the movie, I actually, before I had read the book and I saw the movie, I remember actually kind of liking the movie the first time I saw it, which would have been probably around the time it came out on DVD. So I don't know if it's just growing up, or if it's having read the book or what, but it doesn't have the same impact it felt like it had at one point. So, I don't know. When it came out on DVD, I was probably around 14 at the time. So this was nearly 20 years ago. No, it was actually 20 years ago. So, yeah, I don't know. It's not, I don't hate the movie at all. Actually, I don't hate it at all. It just leaves me with a lot of questions, that's all. So, that's, I don't know what else I can do with this, so we're going to leave this at this. Like I said, we're going to do this book versus movie thing for King 4 more times. We're going to do a lot of the straight-to-video stuff. We're going to do some of the there's another segment we'll be doing that you'll see that relates a lot to this one, unintentionally. So yeah, and a couple and the franchise here or there, new releases, all that stuff's gonna be happening all this month. So until the next thing, that's it.